Mr. Tinderholt.
Disregard.
Chair recognizes Mr. Bonnen.
Move passage.
Question occurs on the
Mr.
passive
Speaker.
House bill. Mr. Tinderholt.
Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman's yielded the floor. We were in the middle of moving passage. Mr. Tinderholt. Question occurs on the passive House Bill 2691. Is there any objection?
That's twice.
Is there any objection?
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Stickland.
I think Representative Tinderholt was wanting to ask questions of the author.
I understand.
Twice
And I
this has
understand
happened.
the author had moved passage.
So at what point are we going to answer the questions of our colleagues?
When they asked to have questions of our colleagues while they're still laying out the bill and they haven't moved passage.
Okay, so if they're standing here at the microphone with notes in their hand, that's not an indication that someone might have a question?
Possibly, Mr. Stickland, but once they have moved passage, they've yielded the floor and we're in the
And
process
did he move
of...
passage while Tony Tinderholt was...
No, Mr. Stickland, he moved passage before Mr.
Did you
Tinderholt.
state before he asked a question
Yes,
that-
I did, Mr. Stickland.
that it had moved passage?
Mr. Stickland, if you'd been paying attention...
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure we have a quorum. I'd like to do a quorum call.
Mr. Stickland, under Rule 5, Section 5, you cannot call that point of order unless 2 hours have expired from our last record vote showing a quorum.
I'd like to ask for strict enforcement
Mr. Stickland's
on
requested
the rest of the
strict-
votes this evening.
Mr. Stickland has requested strict enforcement on the rest of the votes. It will be granted. Question occurs on the passage of House
Speaker.
Bill 2691.
Mr. Speaker.
We're in the middle of a vote, Mr. Kane. I was kind and yielded for Mr. Stickland. Let me dispose of this vote.
Parliamentary
And I will-
inquiry, Mr.
I will
Speaker.
recognize you for an inquiry.
Not before the vote,
At-
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Kane, we're in the middle of a vote. This is the second time we've been in the middle of the vote. And the
Mr.
first time,
Tinderholt requested to be
Mr.
recognized
Kane, the first time I gave the
before-
courtesy to Mr. Stickland to allow him his parliamentary inquiries. I'm now going to proceed with the vote, and I'd be happy to take your inquiries once the vote is over. Question occurs again for the third time on the passive House Bill 2691. Record quote has been requested with strict enforcement. The clerk will ring the bell. Strict enforcement members, vote from your desks. There being 130 ayes and 0 nays, the bill's passed.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Kane,
parliamentary inquiry.
please state your inquiry.
Is it not the case that a motion is not before the body until the Speaker states that motion? The reason I ask it, if I may explain, is that the member moved passage, but that was his voice, not the Speaker's voice, while Mr. Tinderholt was seeking recognition. Thus, when a member moves passage, that's not exactly passage, is that correct? Or a request?
Mr. Kane, I think the point you're trying to make is to suggest that only Dr. Bonnen had moved passage and that the chair had not begun the process of the vote, but the chair had begun the process of the vote.
What should a member do if no one turns their mic on? Should they yell out? Should a member shout loudly if they're not being recognized at the microphone?
Mr. Kane, Mr. Tinderholt was recognized, but the chair had begun the process of having a vote. And so we were finishing that process, Mr. Kane.
Mr. Speaker, was he not standing here before that vote was called for?
Well, someone standing at the back mic does not mean they are asking for anything other than choosing to stand there.
Mr. Speaker, if their microphone is off, how would someone
The
know they
microphone
weren't?
was not off. I had the microphone on the entire time, Mr. Kane.
Yes, sir. Would it be in order respectfully to request that the microphone remain on?
Glad to leave the microphone on, and it was on at that time.